Hello and welcome to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series. This is a bi-weekly conversation series about peace and the adjacent issues. In case you are new to New Hampshire Peace Action, our mission is to contribute to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. The upheavals of 2020 have brought us to a new moment of reckoning and also a new moment of possibility. And this biweekly conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for, and was created out of this moment of possibility where we weren't able to gather together. So we're very excited tonight to bring you Deborah Opramolla, who is chairing the New Hampshire Poor People's Campaign. And I was on the steering committee for about a year and followed Deborah through the 40 days of action. And our plan is for 30 to 40 minutes of letting Deborah talk a little bit about the topic, which is Dr. King's legacy and how the Poor People's Campaign is honoring that legacy and moving that legacy forward. A bit on Zoom etiquette. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. You're welcome during the Q&A to either ask questions directly or to type them in the chat, and I will read them out so that Deborah can respond. I'm not going to take too much more time, but Deborah, thank you so much for being here. Deborah is a well-known disability rights advocate in New Hampshire, a member of the Governor's Council for Disability. Is that
It's New Hampshire Developmental Council.
Got it.
That I sit with.
Yeah, and is a researcher for the National Institute of Health. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Deborah, and I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk to us a bit about PPC and what you're up to.
I like conversations, especially from the community. So I don't want to keep talking. If you have a conversation, question, put it in the chat box and we can begin talking about it. And I can add a little bit more as I go. The Poor People's Campaign began with Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. After he realized when the Civil Rights Act was signed, it wasn't enough. There was still an incredible amount of poverty and segregation still going on. So right before he was murdered, he developed a plan called the Poor People's Plan, which had 3 pillars: systemic racism, militarism, and poverty. So 50 years or plus years later, it was revived by Dr. Reverend William Barber and Dr. Reverend Liz Theo Harris. And we added a 4th pillar, which is ecological devastation. Dr. Martin Luther King was becoming then a revolutionary. He said that there was no need in this country to have such systematic poverty. What was really putting people in poverty? Now, access to education, access to a true economic base in this country. And he wasn't talking about handouts. One of his famous quotes, and we still say this in the United States today, is all the poor has to do is pull themselves up by their bootstraps. However, how can you ask a man or a woman to pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they don't have boots? Never mind the bootstraps. So in this country, before COVID, we knew there was 140 million poor. and low-wage workers. Right? And Martin Luther King knew that too, that the minimum wage needed to raise. Except right before he called the Poor People's Campaign to come to Washington, whether you had to ride the bus, walk, come in your mule cart. And he was assassinated right there. His echelon, which was Andrew Young, Reverend Jesse Jackson, did have that meeting of the Poor People's Campaign. But shortly after that, the campaign went quiet. So what are we doing now as the Poor People's Campaign? How can we raise up in the spirit of Martin Luther King? What are we doing? Well, the first part of it was the vision of telling people that we are back, we are revived. We do have a longer name. We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And during the 40 days, we had nonviolent civil disobedience. I'll let you in on a secret if you didn't know. Will and I got arrested the first week. And I always appreciate the people who stood by us and stood with me, because this is a movement, a grassroots movement, but we do join in with doing what national does. So that means there are 46 states involved in the Poor People's Campaign. And a lot of our movement, we do things together. So the 40 days at 2:00, all of us were in front of our state capitals. The reason I remember getting arrested was it was my first week of really true organizing, and I didn't know anybody on the coordinating committee. Not that they weren't nice people, I just didn't know them. And I had to, after some conversation, I individually went and said, could you please stand with me? Because it's going to look kind of funny if I'm holding this big banner by myself in the middle of the street and they come arrest me. You know, it's not something I've ever done before. So 6 of us got arrested. And the anticlimax of that was when the police said, we've never arrested people so polite. And I'm like, well, we told you we're nonviolent. And they said, but people lie. And I'm like, do you see the collars on all these people that you just arrested? I mean, I don't wear one and I don't have those credentials, but they're ministers and a writer. And so we are peaceful. We do not at any time allow guns or participate in violence. I think we all saw January 6th. That wouldn't have been us. We make our point when we decide that we're going to do a civil disobedience. It's always done in peace. And we have training on that. Everybody trains in order to do that. You can't just show up and say, oh, I'm going to get arrested today. And our question is always very politely, did you attend one of our trainings? Well, no. Well, maybe you can do that next week. So we're very, very conscientious about that. One of the big things that I find about the Poor People's Campaign is that we're an intersectional movement. That means we find more in common with people and community organizations to lift up. You know, as Will mentioned, I'm a disability organizer. I can tell you what's happening in the disability world within a second. However, I depend on those who are working with the homeless to tell me what's going on. But this is the more important part. We're uninterested in just community organizers. We would rather hear from the impacted people themselves. We need to hear their narrative because we're changing the narrator so the narrator is correct. And many people work for the homeless or the mentally ill or the disabled world, but it's not their story to tell. And it's not their story to tell because it's not happening to them. We are a movement of with and not for. So I don't mean to be mean, but a lot of us were raised in a religious belief or a moral belief that on certain times we give money to charities and things like that. And we depend on them to find solutions. Poor People's Campaign depends on working with the impacted communities for the solutions they see that will solve the problems. And that's so hard to understand because we are giving people. And our solution might not work. It might not be the answer. So we really spend a lot of time listening for that impacted story. We have just lost a chair that put me into leadership, so that throws me a little bit. But we are doing a shift in the New Hampshire Poor People's Campaign. We realized that when National came and asked us to do something, we would work very hard to do that action or do that call, and then we would become quiet, and we were losing our base. So we are doing some changes by starting to have community conversations and asking other partners to start connecting with their groups so that we can have an understanding and voice with throughout the communities. Now, this is much harder and a lot more work than what people are used to. It means, especially in COVID, right? How can we reach communities when people don't have access to internet or to Zoom, Facebook? So we're looking at that, and sometimes I have to be brave enough to double mask, put on some gloves, put on extremely warm clothes, and go out into the community. To find out where their needs are and who is actually a developing leader in that community, to hear their story. So that's our focus right now. And plus we do whatever National would like us to do, which leads us to a little bit of story. Because we had a Jericho marcher van scheduled for today. And again, New Hampshire is a little bit in the forefront because we've had peacekeepers since before I got involved with the Poor People's Campaign. And those peacekeepers I trust. Okay. We made a decision that we weren't going to do the Jericho walk on foot because that might put some people at risk. We decided to have just a caravan. And we were very excited. Then January 6th happened. And National has a security team that listens to chatter. And the chatter was the capitals, all 50 states' capitals were going to be attacked. So National asked us to cancel the event. And out of respect, and I certainly didn't want to put anybody in harm's way. And I tried my best to explain to National, yeah, but we could swing left. I know we could swing because New Hampshire knows how to do it on the fly. We can do it. We can do this safely. And they were like, no, I don't want to read about your death later in the newspaper. And I said, okay. However, it means we did swing left. And what we're doing is a community conversation Wednesday night with some of our co-sponsors. And we are making a list of demands that we want to see changed. And for a lot of reasons, as we're listing the demands, we're also beginning to build New Hampshire's beloved community. Yeah, we often talk about beloved community, but we don't talk to each other. You know, we hear some churches, I know the UCC churches talks a lot about beloved community, but you know, it's not beloved if we don't reach out of our comfort zones and reach out into community. So, you know, it's hard. So on Wednesday, we have decided to start having those conversations and reaching out of our comfort zone and really building beloved community. Because what does beloved community do, right? It really builds power to say we stand together in unity, that this is not going to happen in communities. There is no reason in the seventh wealthiest state children are going to bed hungry. Okay, that essential workers making $7.25 an hour, right, can't pay their rent. That what most people don't realize, even in New Hampshire, with this COVID pandemic, we don't have a crisis standard of care plan that's transparent that people know about. But I will tell you that we've been asking that before we had the second surge. The governor told us, oh, we only have 14 COVID people in all of our hospitals. Guess what? Most of the hospitals are at capacity. And what does that mean? It means that decisions are being made who gets what. Okay. I'm a doctor. I will tell you, medically trained, we make quality of life judgments that really make us godlike. Yeah. So if you're coming in with a multiply disabled and need a ventilator, and they're looking at somebody, well, he's healthy and he has a family and you're disabled, we're just going to make you do not resuscitate. Okay, is that okay? That decision is made before they even speak to the family. That's not something, again, in the seventh wealthiest state we should be at. Yeah. So a lot is happening that we know that's not moral, that we don't think of as, we don't necessarily think of, because those are conversations that are had that we might not face. So the PPC in our intersectionality looks to learn about those pieces that our coordinating committee might not know. We look to gather the stories and narratives of people. And our focus is while we do a lot of things nationally, our focus is now in New Hampshire, and primarily New Hampshire. What are we going to do about it? And how can we raise up together in power? How do we speak truth to power. And that's what we work on. And we have to depend on people power to get these things done. Does anybody have a question? I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I do.
Go ahead,
When
Kathy.
you said, it's Kits, I'll change my
Oh,
name.
sorry.
When you said they make that decision before they even talk to the family, you mean the medical team has to make a decision between these two people, and they decide when we approach the family, this is the one we're going to say, better not to have any resuscitation, etc. You mean the medical team?
That's true, but usually how doctors put it is, we decided it's best that you go DNR. Can you sign this release? That's how they say it. That's how we say it. You know?
Right. But so the medical team, you hear this all over the news and everything. Doctors have to make those decisions. And the team decides which of the two has the more viable life.
Correct.
Right. And presents that to the family in a way that they hope the family accepts.
I'm going to say hope is not the word that I would use. They have determined that the family will accept it and goes at great odds to do that.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds, when we say it, it sounds like a reasonable thing that medical people should do. But the reality is that when you triage, we're not at war. Triaging was developed in the military a long time ago to determine who gets what and where, but we're not at war. And who's to say my family member is less loved and less deserving just because of a disability? Anybody else have a question?
Deborah, what's the Poor People's Campaign? What's your current push? And with the first thing we did was organizing towards that 40 days of action. What are you working on now? What's the next big thing that Poor People's Campaign is working toward right now?
National has not come out with something. I believe they're going to return to Moral Mondays again. But the big push is for New Hampshire and some other states is to increase our base, right? You know what that looks like, Will. So that means our community conversations have to have. One of the things that we are talking about is those narrative stories that are so powerful and so necessary, is gathering some of those stories in the state and putting them out in a pamphlet or book form so that people have something to hang on to and see the necessary changes that need to be made. You know, there's some platitudes when you look at the unhoused, and I had someone who I work with say, well, I've been trained to go into those camps and put them in shelters, and they refuse. And I said, have you asked them why they refused? Do they feel safe in that shelter? You know, and what about wraparound services? So when people start letting go of some of their biases, I think by hearing those narratives and reading those narratives, you begin to loosen up on your own biases. So that's a project that we're beginning to work on.
Cool. David has a question. So David says, I've been watching a lot of films about nonviolence in the civil rights movement. The controversy over nonviolence within SNCC, that's SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then between organizations and leaders, and the conversation about legitimate self-defense has continued until today. How is this conversation going within the Poor People's Campaign?
It's a difficult conversation. The past history, the Black Panthers came out of the Civil Rights Movement. And, history gets to be whitewashed a lot. The Black Panthers had food banks and medical care, and they did police in the community. And there was SNCC that has broken away from the nonviolent model. But there's something very powerful to me about the nonviolent model, simply because it indirectly says it doesn't matter. I'm still going to do it, whether you like it or not. And I have an aunt who is still living, who was a trained freedom rider. And she said, she's always saying to me, do it anyway. They might not like it, but do it anyway. And she said they got on the bus and they knew that some would be beaten up, and they knew in their hearts and heart maybe someone might not be coming back, but they got on the bus anyway. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is very famous, right? They knew what that other side of that bridge was going to happen, but they crossed it anyway. And as much hurt and severe damage that was done to that group, when I look at those pictures, I don't see the power of the police force. I see the power of the people who had courage to continue to cross that bridge. It means a high amount of discipline. And I think that's what we're working for nationally, to have a high level of discipline.
Thank you. So the next question is from Joel Berman. Joel asks, 2 years after its revival by Dr. Barber and others, how would you assess the impact of the Poor People's Campaign here in New Hampshire? Have there been observable successes either in legislation or in indicators of public opinion?
I think we've had some successes that people aren't aware of. The Poor People's Campaign is invited to the table. We're not ignored. And that's a huge stepping point for us. We are respected among our collaborating partners. I can, even though Will is not directly on the coordinating committee, I can go to Will and say, what do you think about this? Is it something that your group is willing to do? And that community, that goes a long way to building that intersectionality and fusion model that the Poor People's Campaign wants to build. We are building the people power in New Hampshire, but it's a very slow process. We had lessons to learn and rabbit holes to jump out of, and we're doing it. It's just, I wish there was like this magic thing that we can say, look, we did that. But we have supported a lot of policy, and it has come out to some terms. But unlike a lot of organizations, once we develop our demands, we are not willing to weaken our demands or negotiate down from our demands. And I think politicians are not used to that. They're finally getting used to that. And it's why when we, at one point, and I believe it was vetoed, was we raised the minimum wage in New Hampshire from $7.25 to end up to be $12. And the Poor People's Campaign said, $15 doesn't cover it now in New Hampshire. So what does 5 years from now $12 do? And so we said, don't celebrate, because there's nothing to celebrate. And I think that hurt a lot of politicians' feelings. But truth to power.
As you look forward into kind of the next year or two, um, what do you see? I mean, the last couple of years have been a very tough time to organize, particularly around legislative objectives in New Hampshire. We've had Governor Sununu with veto power. Do you have legislative goals that you're looking at for the next couple of years? Are there particular champions at the state house that you're working with? And again, right now the balance of power is not in the favor of poor people, or anti-militarism or environmentalism or anti-racism for that matter. So you've got an uphill battle. But do you have ideas about what sort of legislative agenda the Poor People's Campaign is going to be advocating for, and where you think you might be able to get a little bit of leverage?
Well, one of the things that legislative wise I've been talking to everybody is, does everybody remember Billy O'Brien? Everybody remember that? He decimated the disability community. That was his goal, all right? He asked us to tighten our belt, and that continued until, he finally said, we've tightened our belt and we're now skeletal. So I said to people, if this marginalized community puts up a fight and gets things through, we can get things through to this Republican place. One of the policies that we will join is low wage worker. We really want to raise the minimum wage in New Hampshire. That's going to be a big fight. But also, the Poor People's Campaign is looking very carefully at the right and bringing the moral question. Recently, a Democratic representative was stripped of her committee seat for saying that the police chief in Troy should be fired, that he was down in Washington, D.C., and they stripped her of her seat because of that post. But they have two representatives who are very anti-Semitic and have posted some really horrible things, but they haven't managed to strip them of their seats or committee. So we're really going to start asking, who are you? You're supposed to be representing the people, and this is not it. And really, we will have some letter campaigns, writing, demanding that these two people be censured and stripped of their committee seats. It will be difficult, but if we're quiet, then they get away with it. And so we will be asking people not to be quiet. So that's one of our big pushes, and really a homegrown issue.
So does Moral Mondays fit into Poor People's Campaign? And I know in New Hampshire we have New Hampshire Voices of Faith, which was born out of the Moral Mondays movement. How does Poor People's Campaign interact with Voices of Faith? And as you work on Moral Mondays moving forward, what do you hope that relationship will look like, and how will you share goals or not?
Well, we will reach out to the interfaith group. I don't have the information about what national looks like on Moral Mondays. But to be honest with you, we know that Mondays at our state house is not a great day to be there. Not much happens there. So Moral Mondays works what is national knows, right, and has worked well. And I am in the process, along with the coordinating meeting, saying things like, how about Moral Tuesday or Moral Friday or Saturday? Because these are supposed to be base building activities. And I remember during the 40 days, students really wanted to be there. They were anxious to take
Mhm.
part, but they were in school, so they couldn't join us. So I'm interested in building out our base to include everybody. So I want to include the interfaith. I don't want to ignore anybody. You know, National has request, but National, I have learned we can form ourselves in the way New Hampshire is, and to let them know that, well, we might do more on Mondays, but we're doing something on Saturday. Thank you. You know, so that we build a base. You know, there's so much work to be done in New Hampshire itself that while we follow national, I'm also going to follow what people are telling me in New Hampshire, right? So if Moral Mondays is not really working for us, well, we'll find a day that works better besides Moral Monday.
So Amy Antonucci asks, could you speak more to how militarism relates to the other issues being addressed? So you talked about being an intersectional movement. How do you see the four pillars interacting? Why are they relevant to each other?
Our military budget is the largest budget for including 12 countries, right? If we took 15 to 20% away from the military, we can have a better public education. We can restructure our institutions and system racism to say there's a punishment for this. You know, white privilege can be addressed and taken away. When we look at economical, environmental devastation, you know, that just means a lot of money can be put into finding sustainable green solutions for our planet. It's the military budget is so huge that 20% would mean that we would actually be repurposing the money to build those social justice bridges and social nets that we have in this country to strengthen them. You know, that's what the militarism is. And when you look at who really goes into the military, the poor go into the military so that they can get an education. You know, so that's a hard way and a difficult way to get a way to pay for an education, which everyone should be the entitled of a choice to go to college. Does that answer your question?
Sure does. Yeah. Thank you. So on the Jericho walk, can you tell us more about what you had planned? It didn't get to happen, but what was your messaging around it, and what was the thought?
The thought was in New Hampshire is I reached out to various community organizers and said, let's do this unity thing. You know, let's gather together, have speeches. You can talk to your issue. That doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be PPC specific, but we have to say that we're joining together. We're standing together, the Unity March. And when the Hebrews marched around Jericho 7 times for 7 days, and then they blew their shofar, and the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Well, we were going to march around the State House 7 times. And because of COVID, there would be some who we felt safer driving around 7 times in a caravan. And we were going to blow shofars and honk our horns to say the walls of injustice are coming down. And we are here and will always be here to bring down the walls of injustice. Um, and really, it was a way to take back the narrative. We are so focused on the poor boys and what they're doing, and they stole the narrative. And we wanted to put the narrative back where it should be placed. And I hope to have a Jericho walk or caravan in the future to say just that. But when times are a little easier.
This has been a crazy period for a lot of social justice organizers trying to figure out how we do the work at a time when we can't gather. Where organizing people power has been, is our bread and butter. And when you can't bring people together, it's hard to harness that power. So next question in the chat from Amy is, how can people support and get involved? What's the best way to tie into the Poor People's Campaign?
You can go to New Hampshire poorpeoples.org and register, and we'll have your email address, and you will get our action newsletter that tells you. I have begun to at least write to everyone at least once a month to say what we're doing and some of the cares we have. It's more of like notes from the chair, which is fairly new. So there's that. We will be putting up at some point a crowdfunding source so that enable us to do some things. One of the states that we work closely with is the Colorado campaign. And what they did this last holiday season was they partnered with some churches and synagogues and Hindus and Buddhists, and we made these little go bags that had warm socks and a hat and blanket and some snacks in these sacks. And it was an introduction into the unhoused community. And each region was given sacks, and we learned a lot by doing that. And we realized that we can't do it in a churchy way, which means that we give out something and then we disappear until the next time we give out something. So really telling the community we'll be back. And that is a Poor People's Campaign mission, that whenever we give or whenever we ask you for something, whether we're registering you, asking you to vote, we want to do that in such a way that they know that we will always be back. We just don't leave communities by themselves.
Thanks. For folks who want to find that link, both Amy and Dana put it in the chat. poorpeoplescampaign.org/committee/New Hampshire will take you to New Hampshire's PPC organizing page. I want to go back a little bit in the conversation and you talked about nonviolent training and discipline. In the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycotts, nonviolent discipline, nonviolent training was a huge part of it. And especially among young people in the last year or two, I've had a lot of pushback on that idea that we need nonviolent discipline if we're going to do strategic nonviolence, that we need to all be on the same page and have shared agreements. What's your personal philosophy? How does that tie in with Dr. King's philosophy? And what do you see the Poor People's Campaign philosophy being on nonviolent discipline and nonviolent training?
I guess I'm going to say something not politically correct. over the summer, I was a peacekeeper at the huge BLM march in Concord. And the crowd size was much bigger than what we anticipated, right? And of course, the counter group shows up. And the police were in riot gear. They were hiding from us, but they were in riot gear. And after the event, when we're going to move on to march back to our starting spot, our group saw those people there, and they some of them really lost control. And I remember being in a demarcation line thinking to myself, they don't realize the danger they're putting the peacekeepers in, because we're going to hold this line. And then I looked back and I saw the bicycle police who was supposed to be protecting them. They left and was leaving it up to the peacekeepers. And I thought that was nice. And the crowd finally got underneath control. But if everyone had had that high discipline and that training, they would have marched right by them. You could fly your flip side of your finger if you wanted to. You could mumble something at them, but they would not have engaged. And, there's the Denzel Washington, Malcolm X film, and they're outside of protesting somewhere. And someone went to him and said, well, this is what we're doing. Do you think you can call off your people? And he snaps his fingers and points to the right, and with precision, they turn. That is the most powerful thing that I have ever seen. And that comes with high discipline. And that's what the PPC is asking for now, that we become very disciplined in what we do.
I know I have found it challenging in the last couple of years to talk to young people about the importance of that discipline, and that everybody understands that we're operating by a certain set of rules that disallow that disallow violence, that disallow the behaviors that tend to cycle out of control. And I know out of the BLM protests this year, peacekeepers at the rally you're talking about were called the White Anger Police. How has that struggle been for you? How has that been for PPC? And how do you see us moving through it? It's been a challenging point for me as an organizer for the last couple of years in talking to young people who don't want to accept that we're going to work with nonviolent with these nonviolent principles at the beginning. How have you navigated that?
Well, we have formed. I'm part of a multi-task force BIPOC committee that people who belong to different community organizations, and we talk about safety because we're often targeted. But what pleases me is that we are being heard, and that the peacekeeping are now deepening the training. Okay. I remember being young and wanted to, any rules that you tell me, I'm going to revolt from, and we as elders have to remember that, right? So we have to put young people in leadership positions, and so they get that experience, what it's like to have your peers rallying against you. The White Anger Management crew saved your life. and, and I think the tendency is like every younger generation is to look and blame the generation before them for all the problems. And my answer to them is, you're too young to have made your mistake in history. And believe me, you will make your mistakes. And your children and your grandchildren will let you know that you made that mistake. And I think I tell them all the time, ageism is racism. So if that's what you want to talk to me about, you're no better than the oppressor. You're just asking me to change the oppression. And it sometimes they step back a moment and start thinking about that. But at the same time, being older, we have to be willing to listen to their concerns. If you can't have your cake and eat it too, no matter what age you are.
Yeah, thanks. If there are more questions, please put them in the chat. At this moment, I feel like that's a really there's a lot of wisdom there in the last few minutes that I'm wanting to sit with, and I don't want to move away from that too quickly. But Deborah, I just want to say on a personal note, thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciated getting to hear from you and getting an update on PPC. We look forward to continuing to work together, and whatever our next adventure is. I know it'll be fun. Do check out the link, which is both, if you're watching this on Facebook, it's in the comments under the video. If you're here, save that link that's in the chat to check out later. We also have a comment from Donna San Antonio suggesting, recommending the statement from Reverends Barber and Thea Harris on the what happened on the Capitol on January 6th. Her adjectives are powerful, timely, and clear. And I haven't read it, but I'm going to look it up very soon. Did you have any final parting thoughts before we break up, Deborah?
I do. It's hard to leave our comfort zone. And the PPC does, when we do a call to action, we do need people to respond. And even before COVID, people had their trepidations about standing up. But we're losing the narrative. The PPC and all organizations need to have us stand and rise up our voices, because our voices do make a difference. If the PPC and then Peace Action does something else and we don't join together, they can pick us off so easily. And so this is really truly a time to unite, stand together, and rise up together.
All right, let's do it. Thank you, Deborah. Join us every other Monday for these conversations. Next week, we'll have Griffin Sinclair Wingate, a former New Hampshire Peace Action board member, who's going to talk about why he works with youth and why we should all work with youth. 2 weeks after that, we will host Eric Chaffetz, a professor I think from Virginia, the University of Virginia. He's going to talk about the impact of American exceptionalism on culture and policy. Follow us on our email listserv to keep track of what we're up to and what our next conversations are. And everybody have a great night. Thanks again, Deborah.
Thank you for having me.